Generative AI was center stage last week at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Now leaders must focus on turning the hype and investment from 2023 into actual value, all while governments examine just how much regulation is needed for the new technology. Here to discuss where AI goes from here as part of Yahoo Finance's theme week, the AI Revolution, we welcome in Tom Davenport, President's Distinguished Professor of Information Technology and Management at Babson College. Thanks so much for being here, Tom. So I would start with how this all becomes real. A lot of the talk that we heard last week was a lot of big talk about how much Gen AI is going to play into these businesses. But I'm looking at sort of actual deployment and monetization. Where are we in that cycle, and how are we going to see that play out?
Well, that's the right place to be looking, and you wouldn't see very much if you're looking in that direction. I did a survey at the end of last year sponsored by Amazon Web Services, and it suggested 6% of companies have any production deployment of generative AI. So lots of talk, but not much action yet.
And when you survey these chief data officers, Tom, these CDOs, and they talk about AI, granted, obviously, as you said, it's early days, early beginnings here. But what are kind of the benefits, the potential priorities, but also the roadblocks they call out to you?
Well, I think the primary activity now is in individual experimentation, and that's going to be hard to measure the benefits, and I think they're not ultimately going to be terribly large. If you look at use cases like customer operations, call centers, contact centers, I think there is likely to be a substantial amount of value. Automated code generation, I think, is going to yield a lot of value, although that's going to take some time, I think, to really settle into development processes. As you can see on the chart, R&D and none of the above are pretty low levels. So a lot of potential opportunity. The biggest, I think, barrier now is in the data and how organizations get their data ready for generative AI.
And how do they do that, Tom? How do they get good data sets? Because, I know there's an enormous quantity of data being generated every second, but is it the right kind of data on the right kind of information?
Well, most organizations these days are interested in how do I train a generative AI model to deal with their own data and their own content. And unfortunately, they haven't really curated or managed that terribly well over time. So the organizations that did this successfully early on, companies like Morgan Stanley, they have a small army of people curating their investment reports and making sure they're accurate and up to date and not overlapping with other investment reports, because generative AI, as we know, if fed poor quality information, is going to give poor quality outcomes.
As you talk to these folks, Tom, across different companies, you survey these chief data officers, so they're at least experimenting with the technology. It's against the backdrop, Tom, of regulation. I'm curious how you see kind of regulation of this technology kind of playing out, at least here in the U.S. And do you believe, Tom, that American regulators and lawmakers have the background, the experience, frankly, the tech chops to regulate AI responsibly and effectively?
What do you think? I think we all know that they don't.
And I've seen the hearings, Tom. This is why I'm asking, because you watch these hearings, the tech execs get dragged up before Congress. It kind of often becomes sort of embarrassing for, frankly, everybody that's involved.
Yeah, I think that's mostly a show. Congress can't pass a budget, so they're not going to be able to pass meaningful AI legislation. I think the only good news for those people who want more regulation, and I am among them, is that I think it's likely that some aspects of the AI Act in the EU will be adopted by companies globally. Large companies have to do business in the EU no matter where they're based. And so I think many of them will adopt some of the AI Act regulations. But, there's also the issue of how do we enforce it? There was an interesting report in the Wall Street Journal this morning suggesting that, one of the few pieces of meaningful legislation we have in the U.S. comes out of New York. It's called Local Law 144 that regulates the use of AI in recruiting and hiring. And this regulation is basically not being enforced at all. Something like 18 out of 400 companies even did any sort of audit at all on it. So we have to put a regulatory infrastructure in place in addition to just passing the laws if we're going to be successful with it.
Well, and Tom, what do you think the urgency level is here on this? Because, we can sort of joke about Congress not really being up to the task, but, I take the example of social media, which was not regulated and exploded. And I think one could argue there have been pretty darn negative consequences from the lack of proper regulation there. So how do you get this done? How do you light a fire? How do you make sure it's done properly?
How do you transform the current operations of the U.S. government? That's an issue that we're all wrestling with every day. As I say, I don't see that happening at a federal level, and it'll, I think, be somewhat chaotic if individual states and even cities start to pass AI legislation. So I kind of think regulation in the United States is a lost cause, but I do think there are some potentials for the AI Act having an influence on US-based companies.
Tom, it's a big, important topic. Thank you so much for joining the show today and helping us walk through it.
My pleasure. Thanks.